Our next speaker is Dr. Laura Christianson. She's a researcher in the Department of Soil, Water, and Climate at the University of Minnesota. She holds a PhD from Iowa State University, and her area of emphasis includes mitigating nitrate losses through drain tile. And this is Laura's first year here with us at the University of Minnesota. We are very glad to have her here.
Thanks, Fabian. Can you hear me okay? Coming through okay on the computers? Okay. Okay. I like that Matt describes himself as his the warm-up act. That means I'm the Taylor Swift for the conference. We are going to talk about the Minnesota Nutrient Reduction Strategy. We'll talk about the 2025 revision to the Minnesota Nutrient Reduction Strategy, and we'll talk about why that matters to you. I also want to introduce myself and my context for this space. When I was doing my PhD in Iowa with Dr. Helmers, the state of Iowa was working on developing their Iowa nutrient reduction strategy at that time. And so I got to see an inside view into the strategy development process. A few years later, when I was working on the faculty at University of Illinois, we worked a lot with the Illinois nutrient loss reduction strategy. And now that I'm here in Minnesota, I'm working with the Minnesota nutrient reduction strategy, working on revising some of the science behind the conservation practices recommended in our Minnesota strategy. So in all of those states, the strategy has mattered to our farmers and our agricultural community because water quality issues due to nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus are not going away. We have a lot of work to do in terms of the agricultural community and the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus that we send downstream. And the strategy specifically matters because it gives options for us to take action to reduce the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus we send downstream. And Matt did a great job of introducing a lot of those options in the Iowa strategy. So as you know, the Mississippi River Basin is one of the largest river basins in the entire world. It touches all or part of 31 states in the United States. And the reason that we talk about the Mississippi River a lot in terms of water quality, as you know, is because of the hypoxic zone that forms in the Gulf of Mexico every summer. This hypoxic zone is caused by nitrogen and phosphorus going down the Mississippi River. I'll mention that we have been monitoring the hypoxic zone since 1985. And our overall goal is to reduce the size of that zone to 1,900 square miles. Now, when I think about the Minnesota nutrient strategy and what's led up to the strategy development process, I actually really start in this timeline right around here in the early 70s, establishment of the US EPA in 1970. And then you might remember our very famous Clean Water Act, which was in 1972. Since 1972, our nation has made massive improvements in the quality of our water in this country. And that's mainly due to the Clean Water Act addressing point sources, cleaning up water coming out of things like factories and wastewater treatment plants. And that's a great success story for us in the waters of our country. Fast forward about 25 years, and you see the Hypoxia Task Force was founded in 1998. The Mississippi River Gulf of Mexico Watershed Nutrient Task Force is the full name. Fast forward 10 years beyond that, and there was some revision to the science that we know underpins what's happening in the Gulf of Mexico. And in 2008, that action plan called for a dual nutrient reduction strategy. It's not just nitrogen causing the Gulf of Mexico hypoxic zone. It's not just phosphorus, but it's in fact nitrogen and phosphorus together. And so I think it's useful to remember that the ultimate goal that we're working towards is to reduce the size of this hypoxic zone. You know, but us being 1,000 miles away, literally, we often don't talk about the size of the hypoxic zone. We talk about these goals. 45% reduction in nitrogen and phosphorus loading is what it will take for us to reduce the size of the hypoxic zone to that 1,900 square miles. And so there's two kind of different goals going on, but we always upstream, up here, we talk about reducing nitrogen and phosphorus by that 45%. So the Hypoxia Task Force itself is a state and federal partnership. The federal agencies that sit on the task force are US EPA, USDA, Department of Interior, the NOAA, and some tribal representation in addition to a few others. And then there's 12 states that all sit on the task force. Now, remember I said that the Mississippi River Basin touches all or part of 31 states, but there's really only 12 states that send the most water and the most nutrients to the Mississippi River. And each of those 12 states sit on the hypoxia task force. Now, I like to think about the hypoxia task force because the times that I have gone to their meeting, it's very formal. Everyone's in fancy suits. The agenda is set well in advance. There's a period for public comment, but it's very formal and you have to request that in advance to get on the list. It's just a very formal, official process. And it makes me feel good that there's high-level officials in our country that are willing to take their time out of their day to talk about issues of the Mississippi River and the Gulf of Mexico very specifically and in a very formal way. That's something that I really appreciate. So remember, task force was founded in '98. In 2008, there was revision to the science of what's causing the hypoxic zone. But what's a real driver for the state strategies is the Stoner memo. The Stoner memo from Nancy Stoner in March of 2011. This was the real driver for why the state started to develop nutrient strategies. The Stoner memo does a couple things. It's not a long memo, but it does a couple things. Firstly, it instructs each state to set nitrogen and phosphorus loading reduction goals and to establish priority watersheds for nitrogen and phosphorus, which you can see the map behind there. The Stoner memo instructs each state to set a timeline for establishing nutrient criteria, which is a little bit of a political issue also. We won't talk about that. And then here's where the state strategies come in. The Stoner memo instructs us, each state, to increase accountability, verification, and public reporting. Public reporting enter the state strategies. The state strategy is a way that we have increased our public reporting, our accountability, our verification of the effort that each state is taking to address nitrogen and phosphorus going to the Mississippi River. Now, keep in mind, the US EPA could have taken a very different tact rather than the state strategy approach. Think about the Chesapeake Bay watershed. The Chesapeake Bay watershed has a TMDL, total maximum daily load. This is a much more regulatory approach that the US EPA took with the Chesapeake Bay watershed. Now, when I think about the Mississippi River Basin, even if you just narrow it to our 12 states, Minnesota is so different from Louisiana. Minnesota is very different from Iowa, even. You know, the agriculture is different across the basin, north to south, east to west. The ecoregions are different. Even our state agencies are very different. The agricultural players, the commodity groups and environmental groups in each state are very different. And so to have a state-based strategy for each state in the Mississippi River Basin, it makes a lot of sense. It gives us a lot of flexibility compared to that Chesapeake Bay TMDL process, which is very top-down, very regulated. I'm glad that we had the state strategy approach here. I'll also mention that once the strategies started coming out in about 2014, 2015, Minnesota was one of the 3 original states that did a heavy science assessment. Not all 12 of the states did a science assessment as a part of their state strategy approach. Minnesota did, and that's a good thing. The other states since then have started to do their own science assessments. And the science assessment is what we'll talk about today. The science assessment includes the recommended practices that we can do to reduce nitrogen and phosphorus going downstream. I also want to point out that the state strategy approach is very often promoted as a voluntary approach. But this word voluntary is very tricky. It's nuanced. We do not get to choose if we are going to achieve the 45% reduction. That part's not voluntary. We get to choose how we will achieve that 45% reduction. And so the word voluntary doesn't mean we get to choose if we're going to achieve the goals. It means we get to choose as a state how. I think that's an important distinction to make. Those goals are not voluntary. What's in our Minnesota nutrient strategy? One of my favorite things in the Minnesota strategy is that it defines us as a headwaters state. Now, as someone who's lived and worked in Iowa and Illinois, I know that Minnesota is not the #1 contributor of nitrogen and phosphorus to the Mississippi River. We know that. However, Everyone else is downstream. We are upstream of everyone. We're a headwater state, and not just for the Mississippi River Basin, but also for 2 other major watersheds. So everyone else is downstream. That provides us a huge opportunity to show leadership in these issues of water quality. And I like that. I also like that the Minnesota strategy doesn't just couch nutrient issues as being a Mississippi River, Gulf of Mexico thing only. It really highlights that we have a lot of problems in our own state in terms of nutrients in our waters. And you've been living under a rock if you didn't see some of this stuff hit the fan last fall. And I will also mention, I just looked at our list of 2024 impaired waters, and we have 143 lakes and streams in the state of Minnesota that are impaired for either nitrate or nutrients, 143. I mean, it's a pretty big state, but I don't know if I'm okay with 143. It seems like a lot. I think we can do better. I'm sure you agree. So what's continuing, what's in the Minnesota strategy? Again, hearkening back to the Stoner memo, the Minnesota strategy defines nutrient loads and defines our priority watersheds for us. Here's nitrogen, here's phosphorus. The Minnesota strategy apportions loads between sources. Here's where we are today, sitting here in this Minnesota nitrogen conference. We have a big amount of work to do to reduce that dark green portion. Here's our phosphorus loads, and you see phosphorus loads from agriculture also is cut out for us. The Minnesota strategy defines our reduction goals and our timelines, but my very favorite part of the Minnesota strategy, and don't forget, strategy came out in 2014. We're now working on the 2025 revision to the Minnesota nutrient strategy. I forgot that. My very favorite part of the strategy, though, is that it recommends conservation practices. It's not just this big formal document with timelines and goals and loads and a portion between loads, and it actually has things, recommended practices in the strategy that we can do to take action to improve the quality of our water. It's an actionable document for me, and that's what I like. So what conservation practices are actually in our Minnesota strategy? Like I said, Matt did a great job of introducing some of these. There's a lot of information on this graph. We're going to hang out here for a minute in case you're trying to read all of it. What I'm showing here is the graph from a really nice paper, Eating the Metaphorical Elephant paper. These are the nitrogen practices recommended in the Iowa strategy, nitrogen practices recommended in the Illinois strategy, and then practices recommended in our Minnesota strategy. The first thing I notice about this graph is that Minnesota has fewer bars than some of the other states. That doesn't mean that some of the practices like shallow drainage don't exist in the state of Minnesota. They're just not recommended in our strategy. And so for me, in my work, this is an important thing because we can make our strategy better. We can add in some of these other practices, and that's what I'm working on doing, and that's a good thing. The second thing that I noticed about this graph, just looking right there at the top, those green bars are really big. Those are the land use change practices. Remember, Matt talked about prairie, and he had that graph where the red and blue lines were really high, and then the prairie lines were very low. Prairie doesn't lose much nitrogen. That's what these practices up here are. For example, land retirement or pasture hay, perennial energy. Those green bars very consistently across all the states, those are our most effective nitrogen practices. They reduce the amount of nitrogen the most. Now, I know there's not a lot of interest in those, but I think it's worth mentioning. The third thing that I want to mention about this graph that I really like how Iowa did it, Iowa has error bars on their practice efficiencies. And I think we can do this for Minnesota too. I think it's an important way to show variability. For example, look at side dressing here. You know, side dressing in Iowa is recommended to reduce nitrogen loss maybe 6 to 8%, but that error bar goes all the way negative. That means when they were doing their review for the Iowa strategy, there were site years where side dressing actually increases nitrogen loss. It's important to capture that variability. We want this average number, but it's also to realize there is variability with our practices. So how do we update these values for conservation practices in our nutrient strategies? It's basically a literature review process, reviewing the studies that have been done in Minnesota and surrounding states to develop a representative value for each practice. Now, the circles around the edge are all the kind of bins of practices that I'm looking at, which is similar to what I showed on that last slide. And then we are looking at nutrients in runoff and nutrients in leaching or tile drainage. Most of the nitrogen stuff is leaching and tile drainage, but also keep in mind, we're not just looking at nitrogen, nitrate, total N, we're also looking at dissolved phosphorus and total P in our Minnesota strategy as well. Dual nutrient reduction goals. So where are we with our nutrient strategy revision? These are the number of studies that I've reviewed for each of the different kinds of practices. You'll notice we're looking again at nitrogen and phosphorus. There happens to be a lot more work on nitrogen 4Rs compared to phosphorus 4Rs. That's just kind of the state of the literature. I'm spending a lot of time looking at cover cropping studies. We've heard several talks mention cover crops today. This is important because we want to have an appropriate value for cover crops in the Minnesota strategy. What can cover crops achieve in Minnesota, given that it's hard to have successful germination and successful biomass growth? My real interest, as Matt alluded to, are some of these drainage practices. So we're really going to work on adding those into the Minnesota strategy. And then the bars over to the right, I'll get to those if I have time. We're on a timeline to get this nutrient strategy revision done. So hopefully including some of the irrigation practices and the manure practices as well. Now, last thing I'll point out, even though it looks like there's a lot of studies available for me to review, not all of these contain useful information for our strategy document, for our strategy process. And we'll talk about why that is. Another way to look at the studies that have been reviewed or that I'm reviewing is on this histogram. And it's really exciting to see that over the last few years, the number of studies looking at conservation practices and nutrient loss have really increased. And that's a good thing for our strategy revision process. Keep in mind, our original nutrient strategy came out in 2014. And so the original science team was working with studies on that side of the bar. I have basically double the number of studies available to that original science team. So we can make our Minnesota strategy a lot better. So what type of studies go into this type of review? This is really getting to the meat of what I'm looking at now. First of all, I'm looking for field or plot studies, not modeling studies. It's important to me to have a study be as the numbers in our Minnesota strategy be as close to a real water sample collected at a real field by a real person in Minnesota, as close to that as possible. Because I think that's what the state of Minnesota deserves, a real, true, raw value. And so I'm not looking at modeling studies. The one exception would be if a modeling study does have original field experimentation that hasn't been published elsewhere. We're also looking for, it's very important to have studies that have an appropriate control versus a treatment. And you remember Dr. Franson was talking about replicated strip trials in the field. You know, for a replicated strip trial, you wouldn't just replicate the same thing over and over and over. You would do that, but then also have a control. You'll always have to compare to a control. You know, and so same thing with this kind of work. For example, we want to look at a higher nitrogen rate versus a lower rate, or the MRTN. So that would be a control and a treatment. Fall nitrogen application versus spring application. No cover crop control versus a cereal rye cover crop in the same year, in the same location. That's very important, in the same year and in the same location. And the thing that a control and a treatment allows us to calculate is a % N reduction. So this math is not complicated. Control amount of nitrogen lost minus the treatment amount of nitrogen lost divided by the control. So for example, if our no cover crop lost 20 pounds of N per acre in that year, minus the cover crop lost, say 14 pounds of N, does anyone want to do that math? 30, yay, very good, yes. And that's just an example of how we would calculate the % N loss reduction or % in reduction. We're also looking for studies reporting annual nutrient loss values. Now, there's two important parts to this bullet point. We want values of nutrient loss. So what does nutrient loss mean? In edge of field studies, there's two things that we always monitor in edge of field water quality studies: nutrient concentrations and water flow, or how much water has left in surface runoff or through a tile pipe. The way we monitor nutrient concentrations is by water sampling. You take a sample of the water, send it to a lab, and that's how you know the concentration of nitrate or phosphorus in the water sampling and analysis. Now, water flow, we monitor in a variety of ways, but again, it's both of those components together. But it's not just those components on their own that we're looking for. It takes both of those components to calculate a nutrient load or a nutrient loss. Now, a little terminology here. A load is just a mass. Like 400 pounds of nitrogen flowed out of that tile last year. 400 pounds, just a mass. A loss is a load normalized per area. We sometimes call loss yield. And that should sound familiar because we talk about crop yield in bushels per acre. It's normalized per area. And so just terminology there, a loss is what we're trying to reduce. So when I say loss reduction, I know that sounds a little weird, but that's why we say that, use that term, loss reduction. And not to beat a dead horse, but the reason we're interested in loss values, nutrient loss values in terms of our water quality studies, is because our practices each work differently. Remember, we have nutrient concentration and water volume that make up nutrient loss. Well, some of our practices address nitrogen concentration. They address this hand. Increasing denitrification reduces the nitrate concentration in the water. Some of our practices reduce the water flow, the volume of water. So that's this hand. Some of our practices reduce concentration and water volume. And that's why we have to look at nitrogen loss, because our practices each work differently. The other part of this bullet is that we need annual nutrient loss values. And let's do an example for why that matters. Hypothetical example, I made these numbers up. Say, for example, that there is a cover crop study that only measured studied that cover crop during the spring period, and it studied no cover crop control versus the cereal rye cover crop. And no cover crop control during the spring, say, lost 15 pounds of nitrogen per acre. The cereal rye only lost 4 pounds of nitrogen per acre. Again, hypothetical example. So that gives me a 73% reduction for that cover crop. That's really good, but that's only over a spring period. So moving forward through the year, what if, hypothetically, both of those treatments lost an additional 5 pounds of N per acre? You can do the math. That ends up being only a 55% in loss reduction. This is why we have to have annual studies, because I can't average that 73%. Say that was a real study. I can't average a 73% in with 55%. So all of the studies have to be on an annual basis. This is really a tricky thing, because keep in mind, I'm also looking at runoff studies, and most runoff studies are rainfall simulator studies that are not annual. So we'll do what we can with the runoff studies. And then the last thing that we're really looking for is that the studies need to be performed in Minnesota or in a similar cropping or kind of ecoregion. And that makes sense because there's, for example, a lot of studies on cover crops in Maryland. Maryland is one of the #1 cover crop adoption states, but it's really not right to average in a study from Maryland into Minnesota. I think you can see that germination and climate are quite different. And looking specifically at drainage, you know, the drainage trends vary quite a bit across the Midwest. Looking at the top graph, you know, Indiana, Ohio, even Illinois, where we work, it's not uncommon to have some winter drainage. But then looking towards the northwestern Corn Belt, Iowa, Minnesota, you see not a lot of winter drainage. And this matters for practices like shifting nitrogen application from the fall to the spring, for example, because if you are in the southeastern Corn Belt, if you move nitrogen application from here in the fall to here in the spring, that could provide, I think you could see that could provide a relatively greater benefit in terms of in-loss reduction versus here when we may not have any winter drainage at all. So we can look at that. These are very early results in our revision for the nutrient strategy. When I looked at studies from Minnesota and Iowa, shifting nitrogen from fall to spring pre-plant, you do see, in fact, Illinois studies end up with a slightly higher average in-loss reduction or in reduction compared to our Minnesota and Iowa studies. And that's due in part because we have different drainage trends across the Midwest. And so very preliminary results, take these with a grain of salt, because they haven't fully been vetted through the faculty yet. And these may not be the way the final numbers turn out for fall to pre-plant in. But I just want to make the point that location does matter. And that's, again, why the state strategy approach makes a lot of sense, because our states are different. So where have the studies been coming from in this review that I'm doing? Not surprisingly, we've been able to get a lot of studies from Minnesota, a lot of studies also coming from Iowa, Wisconsin, Illinois, and Ohio, just based on the number of the studies that I'm able to get. Zooming out, there's been a lot of great work from Canada that is going to inform our Minnesota strategy from a variety of the provinces across Canada. And these studies especially are helpful for snowmelt runoff. That's very important. That's different for Minnesota versus some of the other states. I also want to highlight that I'm taking a close look at some of the studies from Northern Europe. Again, the cropping system in Northern Europe and the Scandinavian countries, Nordic countries may be different, but I'm really trying to get a handle on how our conservation practices work in a cold climate. And that's what we can get from some of those Northern European studies. And that's interesting to see how they may or may not do things differently. So just one last example from very early in the review, looking at wood chip bioreactors. I was able to bin the result. I've been able to bin the results by latitude. So bioreactors that are below 42 degrees north, these would be like bioreactors in Illinois, most of Illinois. 42 degrees north is just north of Des Moines. So, and then bioreactors above 42 degrees latitude, these are the northern Iowa bioreactors in South Dakota, Minnesota, and then Nordic countries. Not surprisingly, bioreactors that are further north have colder water. That just makes sense. Further north, colder drainage water. However, even though we know that temperature impacts denitrification, which is the process that cleans nitrate out of the water in the bioreactor, those northern bioreactors don't necessarily work worse than the southern bioreactors when you look at percent in-loss reduction. In fact, they work potentially even better. But the story is a little bit more nuanced than that, because the northern bioreactors tend to be larger. The bioreactors, especially from Northern Europe, tend to be slightly larger. And so the revision to the Minnesota nutrient strategy is an opportunity to update the numbers here, these edge of field, these in-loss reduction numbers. But the Minnesota strategy is also an opportunity to look at how can we make conservation practices better? What are other people doing that we could maybe use to inform how we do conservation in our state too? And I think that's a good thing. So with that, don't forget, water quality issues due to nutrients are not going away, but we can work together to make those better. And the Minnesota strategy gives us options for how to start taking actions to reduce our amount of in-loss and phosphorus loss. And watch this space. You're going to start hearing a lot more about the revision to the Minnesota strategy over the next 12 to 18 months. And so watch this space and we'll be in touch. Thanks. Yep. So I would include that alfalfa as part of an extended rotation. That's the practice that I would bin alfalfa into. And there's been some excellent studies on alfalfa showing exactly what you're saying. Very little in-loss under alfalfa. And so in our Minnesota strategy, that'll be binned under an extended rotation. Yeah. So yes, that's one of my favorites.
Question is, in your review, where are the biggest research gaps and limitations?
Oh, good question. Phosphorus is always a limitation just because there hasn't been a, we love nitrogen. We're here at the nitrogen conference. We love nitrogen, but there's just always, in my experience, there's been so much less information available on phosphorus compared to nitrogen. So phosphorus is always a gap. Another gap is that there's a lot of lysimeter studies, but none of the other states have included lysimeter studies for a variety of reasons. And so that's kind of a gap of what do I do with those lysimeter studies? Because they're good studies. So how can we include them? Another gap is the runoff stuff. There's not a lot of good runoff studies anymore that have annual values. So yeah, phosphorus and runoff are giving me heartburn.
Okay. Very good. Any other questions? Well, as you can see, we are very pleased to have Laura with us. There's another question. With the increase in studies, do you see the quality of the studies increase, decrease, or stay the same?
Yeah, that's such an interesting question. There's some just real rock star studies, like some of the work by Giles Randall, rock star studies from, that are 20 or 30 years old that are just classics. That's weird to say, but they're just classics. But in the newer studies, I feel like, especially since the state strategies started coming out in the 2014, 2015, it's like researchers kind of responded to the type of data that are needed. And so it's much easier to harvest information out of some of the newer studies. It's just like exactly the type of information that I need. So yeah, it's a good thing on multiple counts.
Are nitrous oxide studies being examined also? For example, or to say, what do we know about end reduction in surface and groundwater and nitrous oxide emissions?
So the answer is yes and no, mostly no. Keep in mind the hypoxia task force is focused on nitrogen and phosphorus in water. So that's the scope of work. How do these practices reduce the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus in water? That's the job. In tandem with that, we do want to identify practices that perhaps reduce nitrogen loss, but also have maybe a disproportional benefit for reducing climate change or reducing N2O. We do want to be flagging those studies and looking at those too, so that we can have practices that provide multiple benefits. There's NPCA is really interested in making sure that we're trying to hit multiple benefits with our practices, like flooding reduction, like wildlife habitat, like some of the climate stuff. So I wouldn't say that I go out specifically to look for nitrous oxide studies, but they are part of the broader pool.
Very good. Well, thanks, Laura.